Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our discussion of critical reasoning. We are going to be speaking about and going through a number of different logical fallacies in this module. So then let's go ahead and jump right into things. The first thing I want to begin with is asking and trying to answer this question: what makes a good argument? This is tricky, right? There's different ways that we can evaluate and understand how an argument might be successful, to what extent an argument might be good. So when we say that an argument or some form of reasoning counts as being good, this actually depends upon two factors. What sort of argument are we considering? And what are your goals? What are your motivations? What is it that you're trying to demonstrate or try to show? And we'll see in the next few weeks that there's actually a number of different kinds of arguments, right? We're going to begin by talking about deductive arguments. What counts as being good for deductive arguments will actually be different with regard to inductive arguments. And we will also consider abductive arguments and how those are successful, how we should evaluate those types of arguments as well. So those are kind of the different things that we'll be considering in the next few weeks. But what we're going to do today but what we're going to do in this module is focus on fallacies. And the way that I want to introduce fallacies is by talking a little bit about how logic is seen as being a normative study. So when I say that logic is normative, what I mean is that there is a way that we ought to think. There's a good way to think. There's a better way to think, right? So when we're reasoning about something, when we are considering and trying to make a decision on something, right, there's better and worse ways to do that. Normative studies are concerned with how the world ought to be, not how the world actually is. Descriptive studies care about how the world is, right? These are studies like psychology that are going to be interested in how the mind actually works, what the mind actually does. Whereas normative studies involving thinking, like logic, are describing how we ought to think. What is a better way to think? So largely, logic is a study of the right way to think. What's the best way to think? But there are ways in which we can consider how we actually think, right? So when we compare that to psychology, psychology is concerned with what the brain and behavior actually does. When we consider logical fallacies, however, we're going to be moving more in the direction of psychology, more of a description of what we actually end up doing. And it's important to do that because we want to avoid logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are essentially errors in thinking or errors in reasoning. So, insofar as our goal is to think well, to reason well, to make good decisions, if we want to do that in our lives, then we will also want to avoid logical fallacies. So, when we think about logical fallacies, we have to remember that that's actually tricky. It's not an easy thing to do. These sort of fallacies are psychologically persuasive, right? They look good. They tend to make us think intuitively this sounds right. But we need to remember that, logically speaking, fallacies are impotent. They don't actually do anything for us. So then, why should we study them? Why should we care about logical fallacies in the first place? The basic idea here is so that we can detect them. If you can understand how they work, if you can get better at identifying them when they occur, then you will be in a better position to be able to avoid them in the first place. But this certainly is tricky. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to do. Logical fallacies are common, they're everywhere, and they're very subtle. Oftentimes, it's difficult to even be able to spot them. Again, they're psychologically persuasive, right? There's no denying that. But when a fallacy is committed, that will actually give us a reason to reject the argument. It'll give us a reason to think that there's something wrong with the argument. What's being presented might seem like a good argument, but it's not. It's not a good argument if it commits these sort of fallacies. However, it's crucial to remember that just because some fallacy is being committed, that does not necessarily mean that the conclusion of the argument is false or that we have reason to reject the conclusion. We only have reason to reject the argument for the conclusion. Or another way to put that is, we have reason to reject the kind of reasoning that's involved in demonstrating the conclusion, but the conclusion might still be true. So that means that the mere fact that a fallacy is committed only gives us justification for rejecting the argument, not the conclusion. If you want to think about a simple sort of toy example, consider maybe there's like 100 different arguments that are trying to demonstrate that God exists. And let's say that all of them are problematic for some reason, right? Maybe we've got reasons to reject every single one of them. Maybe every single one of them commits some sort of fallacy or error in reasoning. Well, the mere fact that we've got 100 different arguments that are really bad for the conclusion that God exists, that doesn't necessarily mean that the conclusion God exists is false. God might still exist in some sense, right? We would just need some other argument to be able to demonstrate that. But the mere fact that the arguments fail doesn't mean the conclusion is false. We would need a different argument showing that the conclusion is false if we were to take that position. And I think it's also important to recognize that there are many fallacies that you will find in an online space. So it's important to be careful. As a general point, I do want to recommend that it's not going to be a good idea simply to dismiss what a person says online simply because they've committed a fallacy. Instead, I think that we should, make this assumption that the exchange is actually worth your time, and then you should move forward with being respectful. Try to explain why the argument has made this fallacy, why there's some error in reasoning in the first place, rather than just completely outright kind of dissing the person or rejecting them or something along those lines. So now that I've sort of set the stage with regard to our discussion of fallacies and what you should expect, I do want to make it very clear what a fallacy is. For our purposes, a logical fallacy occurs when there is some form of an error in reasoning. And there's actually two different kinds of fallacies that we're going to be concerned with. There's formal fallacies, and these occur when there's an error in the formal structure of an argument. And we'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But the basic idea here is that there's something wrong with the use of the rules of inferences. Now, I have not really introduced or said much about the different rules of inference. We're going to be doing that in a few weeks. But these formal fallacies are going to pertain to deductive arguments more specifically. So I'm actually going to hold off talking about the formal fallacies. We will do that in more detail once we've introduced deduction and said more about validity and soundness. For our purposes, we're going to pay closer attention to the informal fallacies. There's many different sorts of informal fallacies, and so this is going to take a little bit of time to go through. But an informal fallacy is also a form of an error in reasoning. And for informal fallacies, these occur when there's an error in the content or in the reasoning about the content of an argument. So basically, the difference here is a formal fallacy is focused on the formal structure of an argument. There's something wrong with the way that we're using the rules of inference. Whereas the informal fallacies, which we're going to pay attention to now, these occur with regard to the content or the reasoning about the content. Now, you'll notice if you've done the reading for this week, Vaughn makes a distinction between two broad categories with regard to informal fallacies. On the one hand, these could be fallacies that occur because they have irrelevant premises. These are premises that have no bearing on the truth of the conclusion. They're sort of like distractions. They lead you astray. They guide your reasoning away from what the main contention of the argument actually is, right? So that's exactly what it sounds like. These are fallacies that introduce irrelevant information as premises. And on the other hand, there's a category of fallacies that occur because they have unacceptable premises. So these are going to be premises that are maybe relevant in some sort of way, but they do not provide support for the truth of the conclusion, right? Maybe they aren't truth apt, or maybe they don't actually offer the support that they suggest that they have. So they might be relevant, so they're different from these irrelevant premises, but nonetheless, they cannot support the truth of the conclusion. And the reason why the premises are so important is because truth is supposed to be transferred to the conclusion, insofar as truth is preserved in the conclusion. And so if you've got a premise that can't even support the conclusion, then it's not going to be a premise that we should accept. Thus, these sorts of fallacies are involving unacceptable premises. Or another way to think about that are these premises, they seem to be dubious in some sort of way. So that's our simple introduction here to informal fallacies. And then now what we're going to do is move on to talk about specific fallacies. We will begin by talking about fallacies that occur because they have irrelevant premises, and then we will look at more specifically fallacies that occur because they have unacceptable premises. So that's what we will do in the next videos.